What would happen if the person who was insulted and thrown out of the kitchen turned out to be the real owner of the restaurant? "Get out! You don't belong here!" Grant Voss's voice cracked through the air like a whip, sharp and cold enough to make the entire Olive and Thyme kitchen fall silent. The sizzling of hot oil seemed to stop mid-bubble, knives froze mid-air, and every pair of eyes shifted toward a man standing motionless by the sink. Eli Hayes. To most of them, he was nothing more than a nameless dishwasher. But to him, every word of that insult cut deeper than any blade, slashing straight into a heart that had once poured its love and pride into this very place. Eli's face was slick with sweat, the steam rising from simmering pots clinging to his sun-worn skin. But the faint tremor in his hands wasn't from fear. It was something colder, heavier, a suffocating anger being held back with every breath. He lowered his head, slowly untying the grease-stained apron, folding it with meticulous care, as if he were wrapping up something far more valuable than a job, his last piece of dignity. Grant took a step closer, his face twisted in a mockery of rage. "I told you before, Olive and Thyme isn't a place for useless people like you. Get out, and don't ever come back." There was no respect in his eyes, only the arrogance of a man who thought he owned the right to decide the fate of others. Eli looked up, his gaze unsettlingly calm, the corner of his lips curling into a bitter smile. He didn't argue, didn't beg. He simply placed the apron on the cold steel counter and turned to leave. Each step he took echoed sharply on the tiled floor, heavy and deliberate, as though engraving every beat of his fury into the ground. The kitchen remained silent, no one daring to breathe too loudly, though a few eyes followed him, fearful, curious, and tinged with quiet pity. And then, as if fate itself wanted to mark the moment, a chef's knife slipped from its rack, crashing onto the steel table with a piercing clang that rang through the kitchen, cold and final, like a verdict for the man who had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Eli paused for the briefest second, his eyes flashing with something unreadable, not the look of a defeated man walking away, but of someone who had already decided to return. No one knew that the man quietly walking out of that kitchen wasn't just a dismissed employee. He was the true owner of Olive and Thyme, the creator of every dish once praised in the pages of renowned culinary magazines, the man who had built this empire from nothing. But now his creation was being desecrated by the very person he had once trusted with it. As the heavy steel door slammed shut behind him, Eli tilted his head slightly, his gaze cold and calculating, and a whisper left his lips, too soft for anyone but himself to hear. "They don't know who they just threw out." And with that, Olive and Thyme had entered a new chapter, a chapter of reckoning. Night had fallen completely, the golden glow from Eli Hayes' spacious office casting long shadows over the stacks of files piled high on his desk. He sat there alone, holding a cup of coffee that had long gone cold without him noticing. The numbers on Olive and Thyme's financial report were more than just numbers. They were accusations, declining revenue, negative customer reviews, employees quitting one after another. All of it pointed to one undeniable truth. Under Grant Voss's control, his beloved creation was dying a slow, painful death. But to Eli, numbers were never enough to tell the full story. He needed to see it for himself, to hear every complaint, every sigh, every tear shed in the kitchen that had once been the beating heart of his dream. And to do that, he couldn't return as Eli Hayes, the celebrated owner who once graced the pages of prestigious culinary magazines. He had to become someone else. He stood and moved to the wardrobe along the wall. Rows of expensive, perfectly pressed suits hung neatly, each one a symbol of success, power, and the image Eli had built over the years. But he didn't need any of that tonight. His hand slid past the smooth fabrics and stopped at a worn, silver-grey hoodie, its cuffs frayed from age. He pulled it out, holding it at eye level. It wasn't just an old piece of clothing. It was a relic from the days when he had worked as a young chef, standing by the heat of the stove for 14 hours a day, just to perfect a single sauce. As he slipped the hoodie over his shoulders, it felt as though a part of his old self came back to life. The man who knew what it meant to struggle, to fight for every slice, every dish. He stood before the mirror. His usually neat hair was ruffled into messy strands, a few stray locks falling across his forehead. Taking a pair of scissors, he trimmed it hastily, leaving a tired, worn-out look. His beard was left scruffy, giving his face the appearance of a man aged by hardship rather than wealth. Finally, he pulled on an old baseball cap, tugging it low to shadow half of his face. The man staring back at him in the mirror was no longer Eli Hayes, the wealthy, successful restaurateur. He looked like a stranger, a man who might be mistaken for a dishwasher struggling to make ends meet rather than a celebrated entrepreneur. Eli Hayes is dead as of tonight, he muttered under his breath, his voice hoarse but firm. There's only Jack now. A nobody. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his eyes hardened with a cold determination. He stepped out of the office without locking the door or turning off the lights. He didn't need sleep tonight. There was only one thought in his mind: to return to the place that once belonged to him, not to cook, but to rip away the mask of the man who had betrayed him. As he stepped out into the street, his shadow stretched long beneath the streetlights, silent but menacing, like a ghost returning for vengeance. The next morning, the atmosphere in the olive and thyme kitchen was nothing like what Eli once remembered. Under the alias Jack, he stood silently before the familiar door. The place that had once been the stage for exquisite dishes was now nothing more than a cold, lifeless kitchen, as bleak and mechanical as a factory stripped of passion. The scent of butter and fresh thyme that used to make his heart stir had been replaced by the acrid smell of old, burnt oil, and more than anything, by the stifling stench of fear lingering in the air. "You're the new guy." Grant's voice cut through the room, cold and sharp. He looked at Jack as if assessing a defective product, his eyes filled with impatience. He didn't bother asking for a name, just tossed him a pair of dishwashing gloves with a curt order. "Get to work. Don't ask questions." Jack gave a slight nod, hiding the icy sharpness of his gaze beneath the brim of his worn baseball cap. He moved toward the dishwashing station, his hands working, but his eyes keenly observing. The entire kitchen worked like a gathering of ghosts. There was no laughter, no casual chatter, only the rhythmic chop of knives and the dull clatter of pots and pans. Ivy, the once renowned head chef, whom Eli himself had trained, now looked broken in spirit. Her hair was unkempt, her face gaunt, and every slice of her knife was slow and mechanical, as if driven by habit rather than passion. Tom, the young sous chef who once brimmed with enthusiasm, now stood hunched over the counter, trembling whenever Grant passed by. Jack studied everything closely, every expression, every flicker of fear in their eyes. He caught Ivy stealing a quick glance at him, before immediately lowering her head, terrified of being noticed. Tom's hands shook so badly he dropped an entire tray of vegetables. Yet no one dared to help him. This wasn't a team anymore. It was a group of people merely existing, trying to avoid being yelled at. Grant stood in the middle of the kitchen like a tyrannical general. His voice thundered as he barked at a young woman assembling a salad. "Faster! This is a restaurant, not a nursing home!" No one dared respond. Heads remained bowed, hands moved nervously, and fear hung over them like a heavy fog. Jack inhaled deeply, forcing himself to swallow the rising tide of anger. He knew he had to stay quiet, at least for now. He was not Eli Hayes, the famous owner. He was Jack, the nameless dishwasher, permitted only to silently observe. But in the depths of his eyes, a storm was brewing. He looked at Ivy, at Tom, at all the people who had once been the soul of Olive and Thyme, and he silently vowed, "I will bring you all back. But first, I will drag him down to where he belongs." Soap bubbles clung to Jack's hands as he scrubbed each dish until it gleamed. But it wasn't just water cleaning them. It was the waves of fury surging in his chest, each motion a quiet promise. He knew this was only the beginning of the hunt. 3 days passed, and Jack maintained his role flawlessly. The silent dishwasher, who seemed to care about nothing beyond the greasy pile of plates and pans in front of him. But behind that quiet facade, he was piecing together fragments of the truth. And slowly, those fragments formed a picture far darker than any financial report had ever revealed. That afternoon, as he wiped his hands at the sink, Jack caught sight of a delivery truck parked outside the kitchen door. The rich aroma of truffle oil and authentic Italian parmesan, premium ingredients he had once demanded the restaurant import, lingered in the air, familiar enough to make his chest tighten. But instead of being taken entirely into storage as before, half the crates were discreetly loaded onto a smaller truck waiting at the back. Grant stood nearby, clipboard in hand, chatting casually with the driver as if this were just another routine transaction. "Got the full shipment?" he asked, his tone disturbingly calm. The driver nodded, handing over a thick envelope. Grant took it without a glance, slipping it into his jacket pocket with practiced ease. The entire exchange flowed smoothly, like a ritual repeated hundreds of times. Jack drew in a deep breath, his eyes narrowing with a cold, sharp glint. He knew that supply list by heart, because he was the one who had created it. He remembered every number, every item. And now, those numbers were being twisted, turned into dirty cash lining Grant's pockets. "You see it too, don't you?" a quiet voice whispered behind him. Jack turned to find Riley, the young server stacking trays nearby. She didn't look at him, only kept moving, her voice just low enough for him to hear. "Shipments disappear all the time. The logs are always spotless, but no one ever checks the actual stock. And Marcus, or rather Grant, he doesn't care. He only cares about those envelopes." Jack didn't respond, just gave a slight nod, though his eyes burned with a ruthlessness he didn't bother to hide. Riley glanced at him briefly, as if she wanted to say more, but in the end, she only shook her head and walked away. In her eyes flickered the same mix of disgust and fear that seemed to cling to every employee in this place. That night, after everyone had left, Jack slipped back into the storage room. He searched every corner, and just as he suspected, the expensive food items marked "fully stocked" were nowhere to be found. In a dark corner, he discovered a stack of invoices hidden behind old flower boxes. He flipped through them, and every figure was perfect. So perfect, it was obviously a lie. At the bottom of each sheet was a familiar signature, Grant Voss, bold and confident, as if the man truly believed no one could ever expose him. Jack closed the invoices, the corner of his mouth curling into a cold smile. His voice dropped to a low murmur, dark and deliberate, like a warning meant only for himself. "Keep signing, Grant. Every signature is another blade pressed against your own throat." The next morning, the Olive and Thyme kitchen worked in that same suffocating silence, broken only by the dry sounds of knives hitting, cutting boards and pots clanging against each other. Jack stayed by the sink, his hands moving swiftly like any ordinary dishwasher, but his eyes missed nothing. He saw it all: the erosion, the quiet collapse reflected in the faces of people who had once been the heart of this place. Tom sat hunched in a corner during his short break, holding an old phone in his hands. His voice was so soft it was almost drowned out by the hum of the exhaust fan. "Mom, I promise I'll buy your medicine. I'll find a way." His words ended with a tremble, then silence. His eyes dropped, and his fists clenched so tight they turned pale. Jack watched him, his chest tightening. The boy reminded him too much of himself years ago. A young chef working himself to the bone just to pay for his father's medication. At the vegetable station, Ivy froze when Grant suddenly approached. He slammed his hand on the table, making the knife slip from her grip and almost fall onto her foot. "If you cut this slow one more time, you can get out of here for good. You hear me?" Grant barked, his voice sharp and threatening. Ivy bit her lip, saying nothing, her shoulders trembling as a tear rolled down her cheek, quickly wiped away as if it had no right to be seen. No one spoke. No one even looked. The kitchen kept moving as if this was just another ordinary moment. That night, after the kitchen had closed, Jack didn't leave right away. He walked to Ivy's workstation. Up close, it was worse than he imagined. Dull knives that couldn't slice a thin piece of meat, a cracked cutting board, rusted scissors. Jack slipped off his gloves and sat down. One by one, he sharpened the knives until they gleamed, replaced the frayed straps on the cutting board, and wiped every drawer clean. Everything was set back in perfect order, just like he had once demanded when he was still the head chef. He stood there for a long moment, looking around that small corner of the kitchen, a place that used to echo with laughter when Ivy still worked with passion. "Tomorrow, you'll remember who you used to be," Jack whispered, his voice low, almost like a promise. Then he left, leaving behind a workstation spotless and bright as new, with no note, no trace stool. The next morning, Ivy walked in, her eyes still tired. But when she saw her station, she stopped in her tracks. Her hand trembled as she touched the newly sharpened knife, and for the first time in months, A spark appeared in her eyes, a fragile spark of hope, but real nonetheless. She didn't know who had done it, but that small glimmer felt like the first sign of belief returning. Jack watched from a distance, the corner of his mouth lifting into a faint smile. He knew these people weren't weak. They just needed a reason to rise again. And soon, he would give them that reason. When lunch service began, Jack was no longer just the silent dishwasher. He had started a dangerous game, a psychological battle where his opponent didn't even know he was being hunted. Grant Voss stood there, arrogant as ever, running the kitchen like a tyrant. But Jack was ready to tear that mask off, and he knew exactly how to make Grant burn himself. It began when Jack, while arranging plates, spoke just loud enough for everyone to hear, "Missing truffle oil for the 3rd time this week. You know about that, right, Grant?" The entire kitchen froze. Ivy looked up, Riley blinked in surprise, and Tom flinched, dropping a plate. Grant spun around, his eyes blazing, his voice tight with anger. "Your job is to wash dishes, not ask about inventory." Jack only nodded, his tone calm, almost indifferent. "Sure, I just wash dishes." But that very calmness was like throwing oil on fire. Grant stormed toward him, his face flushing red, his breaths coming quick and heavy. "Don't think just because you've been here a while, you can question anything. I say wash dishes, you wash dishes. I say shut up, you shut up." Jack met his eyes, his gaze unnervingly steady, his voice low and deliberate. "I'm just doing my job. But if something's wrong, everyone would want to know, wouldn't they?" The words cut like an invisible blade. The kitchen went silent, so quiet that the sizzle of hot oil sounded deafening. Grant's teeth clenched, his face turning crimson, before he suddenly exploded, shouting, "I said shut up!" He shoved Jack hard, sending him crashing back against the steel counter with a loud clang. A knife slipped off the table, clattering onto the floor. Everyone froze. Riley covered her mouth with her hand. Tom stepped back, eyes wide in shock, and Ivy gripped the handle of her knife tightly, her eyes burning with anger, though she still didn't dare speak. Jack didn't fight back. He stood still, his breathing calm, his eyes locked on Grant's, without a single blink. It wasn't the look of a man afraid. It was the look of someone who knew he was the one in control. Slowly, he straightened, brushing the dust off his sleeve, and spoke, his voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through the silence. "You just showed everyone who you really are." A long, heavy pause followed. Grant's breathing came fast, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles whitened, but no words came out. Around him, every pair of eyes, afraid, confused, and questioning, as fixed on him now. Jack bent down, picked up the fallen knife, placed it back on the table as if nothing had happened, and walked back to the sink. His lips pressed together, hiding the faint, cold smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He didn't need to win today. All he needed was to plant a seed. And Grant, with his own anger, would water it himself. The game had begun, and Jack knew Grant wouldn't escape the trap he was walking into, step by step. The next morning, Olive and Thyme was filled with a different kind of atmosphere. It wasn't the smell of food or the sound of knives hitting cutting boards. but a tense, invisible weight that spread through the kitchen. Those who had arrived early had already heard whispers about the argument between Jack and Grant the day before. No one dared to speak of it openly, but the quick glances, the exchanged looks, all carried the same question. Who exactly was Jack? The answer came sooner than anyone expected. At 9 a.m., just as the shift began, the kitchen doors swung open. The heavy sound of leather shoes echoed, each step firm and deliberate. A man in a grey suit entered, his back straight, his face cold, and his eyes sharp like blades cutting through the room. No one recognized him as Jack, the quiet dishwasher, because today, standing before them, was not Jack. It was Eli Hayes, his true self. Grant was barking orders at a staff member when he froze, his face draining of color, eyes widening in shock as they locked onto Eli. You! He stammered, his voice trembling for the first time in front of his staff. Eli didn't let him finish. He slammed a thick stack of documents onto the steel counter, the sound cracking through the silence like thunder. These are the purchase invoices from the last 3 months. Every signature, yours, Grant Voss, states the goods were received in full. But that's not the truth. The kitchen went completely silent. Eli flipped through the papers, his movements slow but decisive, each page turned exposing another layer of betrayal. The neatly written numbers, the bold signatures, undeniable evidence. Ivy, Riley, and Tom stepped closer, their eyes glued to the documents. Riley's hands trembled as she picked up a page, her voice catching. This is his signature. I saw him sign it right in front of me. Grant's face turned pale, his attempt at composure faltering as his voice quivered. It was just a mistake. I didn't. Eli cut him off, his tone sharp as ice. Mistakes don't come with envelopes of cash. I saw you take them. And last night, I went into the storeroom myself. Those expensive shipments were never received. A ripple of murmurs spread through the kitchen. Tom clenched his fists, his fear replaced by anger. Ivy glared at Grant, her eyes filled with hatred. Riley quietly lifted her phone and snapped photos of the documents. Eli fixed his gaze on Grant, his voice low but carrying the weight of a verdict. You didn't just steal from me. You stole from the people in this room, the ones working themselves to exhaustion, to keep Olive and Time alive. Grant stepped back, sweat beading on his forehead, but every eye was now locked on him, eyes that had once been filled with fear, now burning with rage. Eli didn't need to say another word. The truth was laid bare, and for Grant, every path to excuses had been cut off the moment Eli walked through that door. Grant backed step by step against the kitchen wall, his face pale, his eyes darting wildly as if searching for an impossible escape. The people who once bowed their heads before him now stood in a tight circle, silent but heavy with anger that had been building for months. Their eyes no longer held fear, only the fury of those who had suffered too long. Eli stood tall, one hand resting on the stack of documents, his voice deep and steady like a final verdict. You didn't just steal money, Grant. You stole the trust of everyone here. You're out of chances. As soon as Eli's words fell, the kitchen doors opened, and 2 security guards stepped in. The sound of their shoes striking the tile echoed through the room like a death knell. Grant stumbled back further, raising his hands in panic, his voice breaking into desperation. "Wait, Eli! I did everything to keep this place running. You have to believe me. Without me, Olive and Time would have fallen apart long ago." He tried to twist his excuses into something believable, but no one was listening anymore. "And how exactly did you keep it running?" Eli replied coldly, his tone low, but cutting through the air like a blade. "By turning this place into hell for my staff? By stuffing dirty money into your pockets while these people worked themselves to exhaustion? No, Grant. You didn't save this place. You only saved yourself." The guards stepped forward, each gripping one of Grant's arms. He jerked violently, trying to break free, his voice rising into a desperate shout. "You'll all regret this. I kept this restaurant alive when you weren't here. You're nothing without me." But his words were empty, meaningless now, and no one cared to answer. Ivy stood straight, her eyes cold as ice as she watched Grant being dragged away. Riley bowed her head, but her hand tightened around her phone, as if holding on to proof that justice had finally arrived. Tom, the young line cook, burst into tears. Not from fear, but because for the first time in months, he felt a crushing weight lift off his chest. The kitchen doors opened one last time as Grant was escorted out. He glanced back, his eyes filled with bitterness and regret, but Eli said nothing. He simply stood there, calm, watching as Grant disappeared beyond the doorway. No one spoke, but the heavy silence shattered when a single clap broke the air. Ivy started it, slow but certain. Riley joined in, then Tom, and soon the entire kitchen was applauding, not out of glee, but as the sound of long-awaited release. Eli didn't smile, didn't look victorious. He stood still, watching them, letting these people savor the moment they truly deserved, the moment of freedom. His eyes held something deeper, not joy, but the weight of someone who knew there was still so much work to be done. Because Olive and Time could not be saved simply by removing one traitor. After Grant was taken away, the kitchen remained silent, but it was no longer the suffocating, tense silence from before. It felt different now, like the stillness after a storm, where no one could quite believe that the harsh days had truly ended. The clapping had stopped, but the looks on everyone's faces had changed. There was no more fear, no more avoidance, only hope, fragile but real. Eli stood in the center of the kitchen, slipping off his gray vest and hanging it neatly on the rack. He looked around at every face before him, then began to speak. His voice wasn't raised, it wasn't loud or dramatic, but every word landed like a solemn promise. Olive and Time is not just a restaurant. It used to be a family, a place where every dish was made with passion and pride. And I let that be lost when I left. I'm sorry for letting you endure these past months. Ivy lifted her head, tears welling in her eyes. Not from fear this time, but from emotion. Tom stood behind her, clutching the sleeve of Riley's shirt as if to steady himself, while Riley nodded quietly, her eyes firm with determination. Eli continued, his voice lower now but rich with emotion. Starting today, everything changes. We're going to rebuild this place, not just with great food, but with trust and respect for one another. Olive and Thyme will no longer be a cold workplace. It will become what it was meant to be, a home. He stepped closer to Tom, placing a strong but warm hand on the young man's shoulder. You've been carrying too much, Tom, but from now on, you won't have to fight alone. I want you to keep learning, to become the best chef here, and I will be the one to teach you. Tom looked up at him, his lips trembling. I'm not sure I'm good enough. Eli smiled, his gaze unwavering. You will be, because this time you won't be alone. Slowly, Ivy stepped forward, placing her hand on Tom's. Riley joined them, laying her hand on top without hesitation. The room fell silent again as others began to move, one by one, forming a circle of linked hands. No one needed to speak. Their eyes said it all. It was a promise without words. From now on, none of them would stand alone. Eli took a step back, watching them, pride mingling with the weight of responsibility in his eyes. He knew this was only the beginning. Restoring Olive and Thyme wouldn't be easy, but today they had regained something more important than any profit: trust. He whispered softly, almost to himself, his voice deep and sincere. A restaurant doesn't live on profit. It lives on people. He took a long breath, looking around the familiar kitchen filled with so many memories. This time, he swore he would never let Olive and Thyme fall into darkness again. And starting today, a new chapter for Olive and Thyme was being written, by the hands of people who truly believed in each other. A restaurant can survive on great food, but it can only grow strong and last when it respects the people behind it. The story of Eli Hayes is not just a lesson about justice. It is a reminder that the true value of success always begins with how we treat others. If you believe that respect can change everything, hit like and subscribe to help share inspiring stories like this one. And don't forget to leave a comment with 3 simple words. Respect comes first, because that is the most important thing for any team to stand strong.